you here to learn about what it takes to be an accredited living wage employer. This will be outlined by our...
Hey, Google.
Oh,
No.
sorry. This will be outlined by our living wage employer lead, Felicia, Jordan Cole from MinterEllisonRuddWatts, and Justin from Westpac, New Zealand. These employers will outline firsthand what it means to be accredited and why they personally view it as a necessity for their business. Before I pass it over to Felicia to kick us off, I'll just run through some housekeeping. We will ask that you put your name and organisation in the Teams chat so we're aware of the attendees at this event. We will also be recording the seminar, so please note that any private messages between attendees will be visible in the Teams minutes, so just be aware of that. We would ask also that everyone keeps their microphone on mute up until the Q&A kicks off, which will be indicated. So that's about it. So with no further ado, I'll pass over to Felicia, our Living Wage Accreditor and Program Lead.
Kia ora koutou, ko Felicia Shearer, toku ingoa, and welcome. So exciting to see you all on the screen. I'm going to take you through a little bit of background and history of the living wage movement, just to give you some context and tell you a little bit about this amazing organisation, which you are potentially, hopefully, looking at becoming a part of. So I'm going to be a little bit fancy and share my screen. And bear with me, I live in rural Auckland, so sometimes it can take a little while. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint? Yes, cool. I'd like to introduce you to my mate, Rose. At the time this photo was taken, Rose was the main breadwinner in her family. She was caring for her elderly parents and also her sick husband. Rose had worked for the New Zealand Police as a cleaner for over 15 years. She worked 65 hours a week, earning the minimum wage. Rose struggled to make ends meet for her family. In fact, Rose and her husband moved back in with her parents because they couldn't afford to pay rent and were seriously in arrears. Now imagine the difference earning an extra $159.25 per week would have made in Rose's life. Now that's the difference between the minimum wage and the living wage for 65 hours. Or even $98, the difference for 40 hours. The difference may simply have been she could reduce her hours from 65 to 40. Now, the initial conversations around the concept of the living wage here in Aotearoa began in 2012 in response to the growing level of working poor. That is, workers like Rose who were in full-time employment and who, through no fault of their own, were still unable to make ends meet. Through these conversations, the movement grew and developed. The Living Wage Movement is a broad-based organisation made up of the three streams of civil society: faith groups, unions, and secular community groups. These groups advocate for businesses to pay the living wage, an hourly rate which enables the worker and their family to live with dignity, afford the basic essentials, and to participate as active citizens in society. In 2013, the Living Wage Movement Aotearoa New Zealand became an incorporated society, and the first living wage rate, calculated by the Family Centre Social Policy Research Unit, was announced. The calculation reflects the basic needs of workers to survive and thrive, and includes expenses such as food and rent costs, energy, health, communication, and education. The rate is updated annually and is currently announced on the 1st of April, or nearest business day, and becomes effective on the 1st of September of the same year. The calculation is reviewed every 5 years, with the next review taking place next year. In 2014, the Living Wage Employer Program was launched, and the first 10 living wage employers were accredited. These employers were from a handful of industries: unions, community groups, healthcare, printing, and food manufacturing. I'm happy to say that 9 out of 10 of these businesses retained their accreditation status 8 years later. And of course, are now part of a network of more than 360 accredited living wage businesses from a diverse range of industries, including the banking sector, 5 city councils, and a growing legal sector. Small businesses, large businesses, corporates, NGOs, living wage employers have a presence in every region and almost every industry of Aotearoa. The top photo is of Leonie Morris from the Auckland Women's Centre. They were definitely one of the first living wage employers in the first 10. And Tommy and James from Little Island, they weren't quite the first 10, but they were somewhere around 12 or 13. The need for an accreditation program was driven by these early adopters of the living wage. They saw the benefits not only of paying the living wage, such as is on the slide, increased productivity, reduced absenteeism and unexplained sickness, an increase in staff retention, and also attracting a higher quality of staff. I'm sure Justin and Jordan will go into that a little bit more. But these early adopters saw that accreditation would bring value, transparency, and meaning to being a living wage employer. My predecessor, Dinah Urquhart, who I know is on this call, often said living wage employers are the real deal. And she's right. The living wage employer logo and name are trademarked. Living wage employers are businesses who are authorised to use this branding because they have been approved by the Accreditation Advisory Committee as satisfying a set criteria. They have signed a licence and paid an annual fee. Accreditation shows consumers, colleagues, and competitors you are authentic because you have voluntarily signed up to be held publicly accountable to your commitment to these criteria. In fact, living wage employers are sought out through social procurement, and B Corp has included living wage employer accreditation as a verification tool in Aotearoa. Being an accredited living wage employer means you walk your talk and you can prove it. What does it mean to pay the living wage or call yourself a living wage employer without accreditation? I'm not sure, but it's not the real deal. This is Matt Morrison from Karma Drinks, who I'm sure you will be familiar with. This is his view on being a living wage employer. It's the people who deliver our drinks, who sample our drinks to shoppers in supermarkets, and who run our accounts, who are most important to driving our growth and driving our brand. So it's vital that they are reasonably paid and feeling some karma from their hard work. The living wage is part of ensuring they feel appreciated for the amazing work they do. Back to Rose. Fortunately, Rose's story has a happy ending, and she is now receiving the living wage from the New Zealand Police and is able to spend more time not only with her grandchildren, but she has become a staunch advocate of the living wage and is devoted to ensuring that other workers are also receiving the living wage. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to take a little breather. But I will be back a little bit later on to talk about the accreditation process and criteria from a very practical level. But before I go, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Justin Brochocki, Head of Property and Procurement at Westpac and Living Wage Principal Partners Council member. Justin has been in procurement roles for circa 20 years in New Zealand, Singapore, and the UK. In his previous role as GM of Property and Procurement at Kiwi Bank, Justin oversaw Kiwi Bank becoming an accredited living wage employer, so has first-hand experience of navigating the accreditation process through the lens of a large business. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Felicia, and hopefully you can all hear me. I decided not to put my massive headphones on and talk through my speaker, so I can put my headphones on if you need. Thank you for inviting me to speak today, Felicia and Finn. And for me, this is a topic that has become quite a passion of mine as a procurement and property professional. And if I think back to Kiwi Bank, maybe sort of 3 years ago now, I think, Felicia, is when we first were in contact with each other. And the CEO shoulder tapped me and said, I want Kiwi Bank to become living wage accredited, and I want you to run that accreditation process. And I started, my immediate thought was, oh God, how hard is this going to be? But actually pretty straightforward, and I'll talk you through a little bit about it for those of you on the call who potentially are considering it and are worried about, you know, the effort and work that it takes. In short, the way we looked at it, the way I looked at it, the way my team looked at it was there's two components to it. There's looking at your own staff, your direct staff, and ensuring that they're paid the minimum living wage, and if not, what would be required to get them onto the living wage. And for us, that was working with the HR team to understand pay and to get various people uplifted. Kiwi Bank was really good in that actually everyone was paid at least the living wage, so there wasn't too much effort there. The second component was looking at our supplier base and trying to, I think, identify initially which suppliers were in scope and not in scope to meet the criteria, and then working with those suppliers to understand really where they sat in terms of who they were, who were the staff who were assigned to our account, also the Kiwi Bank account, and then working through the process contractually to get that supplier to pay the staff supporting our account the living wage. That was probably the only time-consuming part where you're just, working through named individuals and making sure that the right thing is being done by our suppliers. The contractual component was really pretty simple. It's just a variation to our contract, and if there was an uplift in the amount we paid them, then that was worked through. It's then looking at various sort of criteria and certification and working with Felicia's team to sort of make sure that the boxes are checked and that we can evidence that we've got all that in place. And that we're communicating it out to our staff and suppliers accordingly. The process isn't really, I would say it took us probably 6 to 8 weeks, of which there were probably a good 1 or 2 weeks of hard work to get us over the line. And that's maybe a slightly larger organization in a regulated bank. It might be a lot less time for smaller organizations. I would say that the living wage criteria and process is pretty easy to follow, and Felicia and her team were around it quite a bit when I was calling, asking about this or that. It was a pretty straightforward process in that regard. If I look at 2 or 3 years on, I left Kiwi Bank about 3 or 4 months ago, and also looking at Westpac, where I'm at now, who I think, tell me if I'm wrong, Felicia, I think we were the first bank to become accredited as living wage employer. Certainly talking with my team and some suppliers here, and knowing from my experience at Kiwi Bank, the benefits are not always so obvious, but they are pretty significant when you scratch beneath the surface. And what I mean by that is a lot of the people we're making their lives better off are sometimes the invisible people, it's the cleaners that turn up after hours, and it's the security guards, and it's the people in the mailroom who, you know, aren't visible to people on the floors. So when you scratch beneath the surface and see whether we're making a real difference, if this is, you know, signing up and being a living wage employer is making a difference, I've found that it actually is making quite a significant difference to individuals. You know, I've got an example where actually we have improved the lives of one lady and her husband, I believe, in a different organisation, is a living wage accredited. They've now got enough money to bring some of their family members over to live with them in New Zealand from one of the Pacific Islands. We've got examples of others who can actually afford to spend a little bit less time working and more time with their children or grandparents, which is a social and from a societal perspective, that's huge. And as an employer, it makes me feel very proud that both Kiwibank and Westpac, you know, have helped, you know, a number of people be better off, not just, you know, with money in the pocket, but actually what they can do with that spare time or with that slightly additional money. We've seen retention rates improve with our supplier base. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly because suppliers sometimes have, you know, significant number of people on multiple different accounts. But we are seeing retention rates improve. We've seen, you know, I've got examples of the last place I was at where quality improved. I think our relationship with suppliers has also improved. You know, it's not about negotiating hard. It's about changing that mindset within procurement to ensure that living wage is the minimum we pay. Sometimes we're happy to pay more if the quality is better. And so that it really has changed the way we look at some components of how we've procured in the past to how we procure now. The only other thing I would say is, were there any challenges? Not really. I think we were very lucky. I don't know if this is always the case, Felicia, but we had direct access to you and your team. And so where we did have a question, it was pretty easily and quickly answered. But a lot of it's pretty intuitive once you understand the criteria and the process. I know you might talk on that a little bit more. So no, there's no real challenges from our perspective. Every year, when the new rate is announced, we now have a process where we can work with HR and with our suppliers and make sure that, you know, payments are uplifted accordingly and variations to agreements are made. And I think once you've been in that cycle, you know, 1 or 2 years, that it just becomes bread and butter. So that's it for me. You know, if anyone wanted to ask any questions outside of this webinar, I'm sure Felicia could share my details, or you can look me up on LinkedIn and send me a message, and I'll happily answer any questions that any of you have. Or if you're working through accreditation and you weren't sure about this, that, or the other, or what suppliers are in scope, or how we deal with certain suppliers, please just reach out. I'm sure I can help. Over back to you, Felicia.
I'm going to pass it to Finn.
Fantastic. We'll just now shift to our second employer speaker, and that is Jordan Cole from MinterEllisonRuddWatts. So I'll pass to you now, Jordan. You're muted, Jordan, I think.
There's always one, and that's
oh, there we go.
G'day. Sorry about
Fantastic.
that. Thanks, Finn. Yeah, so what I was saying, I'll repeat that now. I'm Jordan Cole. I'm the Operations Director at MinterEllisonRuddWatts. And part of my role is oversight of the firm's ESG strategy and our overall people, communities and environment strategy. And so thanks for the invitation, Felicia, to come and talk. And like Justin, there are some things here that are a little bit relevant, similar to Justin's experiences as well. So I'll talk to our living wage certification experience. So I guess to start off with, we made the call back in 2020 to start paying a living wage before we sought certification. So we started the certification process in July last year. So we've been paying our staff and cleaners and contractors at least the living wage for about 18 months. So it started with our cleaners, and as Justin alluded to, that was just making sure that we varied particular contracts. We were running some procurement exercises at that point in time, so it kind of just seemed a bit timely as well. And to us, it recognised a little bit of what Justin was talking about in relation to the cleaners and mailroom staff, where we rely so heavily on those services, as most businesses like yourselves will as well. Actually, fast forward through the pandemic as well, and COVID really reminded us of that as well, where, you know, at the drop of a hat, we needed a cleaning crew to come in before or after a lockdown, or and those types of things. So it really kind of came home for us through that pandemic. So we were going through the process at the time back in 2020 of reviewing a number of outsourced providers and bringing several functions in-house. And we wanted to make sure that as part of that exercise that we were being quite deliberate with our salary benchmarking for those, essentially for those new roles that we were bringing in-house. And so the living wage featured quite heavily in that process, you know, mailroom type functions. And so the alignment to the firm's strategic priority around ESG and sustainability kind of talk to that, and one of our goals in that area is to make a positive impact for our people and communities. And so we felt quite strongly that paying the living wage spoke quite clearly to that ambition. And we also, above everything else, we just had quite a strong view at the time that it just aligned with our values, and at the end of the day, we felt that it was the right thing to be doing. And so as part of forming our sustainability strategy and working with our various suppliers, we put in place a responsible consumption and production policy, essentially a procurement policy that has aligned ourselves with several UN sustainability goals. So Justin talked a little bit about procurement as well, and for us it means that you know, when we're procuring goods and services, we've got a number of check boxes that we have to make sure that we're working through, particularly around things like modern slavery and a range of other things. But for us, living wage is a deal breaker as well. So, and you know, some of you who will be going through the process or will be about to will kind of embark on that juggling exercise of kind of how deep into your supply chain do you go. And so we took a fairly realistic approach to that, and certainly Felicia and the team gave some really great guidance to us on that. So and we apply that lens even now when we're either procuring new services or taking a new service to market, the living wage as a deal breaker. And so when we put that in place, and this is just actually drawing on, Felicia, your comments around your case study of Rose, we actually got some fairly unexpected feedback from our cleaning staff. So we had some day cleaners and evening cleaners as well. And so we got handwritten cards and all sorts of nice messages left on our desks. And so the comments that you made in relation to Rose, Felicia, kind of rung true. And I think you know, from firsthand experience, makes an enormous impact in people's lives. So that kind of just reminded us, I guess, that it is the right thing to do. And so we then decided to seek accreditation, actually because our clients and prospective clients were asking us about it when we were pitching for work or pitching to keep work. They were asking us, like they will with most people on this call, I guess, when you're pitching for work, in the same way you will when you're procuring goods and services. You will want to know all about the business that you're about to purchase from. And so they wanted not so much external certification that we were doing, but they were certainly asking for evidence about it. And so we thought, well, we may as well just go down and get that certification process rather than providing a range of information every time. And so I guess that talks to Felicia's earlier point as well about certification gives you that ability to say that you do walk the talk and that it's independently verified each year. And so we figured since we were already doing it, we would just go ahead. So we did that. We started that process in July last year. And our first step was obviously to check that criteria, making sure that our actions and data aligned with that criteria. And so in terms of the actual certification process, we actually had very similar experiences to Justin and equally a very similar time frame, although we were slightly less, about 4 weeks, but it probably talks to us being quite a bit smaller than Kiwi Bank. But I guess above all else, we actually found the process to be incredibly supportive and seamless. So we had quite a few calls with Felicia and the team just about what information was needed. Some of it was quite new to us, some of the criteria, which I'll go into shortly. And so we had a few teams with them, a few meetings with the team to kind of go through that. But we looked at the 4 buckets of criteria essentially and kind of just worked through them bit by bit. So the first one and probably most obvious one is making sure that everyone on your own payroll is paid at least the living wage. And for us, much like Justin, all of our staff are. And in fact, over and above that, what we do every month, and we were doing this before certification as well, is we run a whole lot of reports of metrics every month so that we can keep an eye on what people are doing in terms of working overtime and going above and beyond, and really just to make sure that when people's hours increase because they're working on a particular project or file, that actually their average hourly rate doesn't then dip below the living wage. And if it does, it actually hasn't ever. But if it were to, we would top them up so that we can sort of say safely, hand on heart, that we know directly or indirectly no one is actually getting paid less than the living wage. Benefit of a law firm is everybody's time is tracked, I guess, so it's relatively easy for us to do that in our business sense. So the next thing for us to do was make sure that we were paying all our indirect workers, so all of our contractors. And this was what I alluded to earlier around how long's a piece of string and kind of how deep down the supply chain do you go. And so, as I said, Felicia's team were great in helping us with that. And essentially it came down to that regular and ongoing basis. So who do we have a regular and ongoing relationship with? And we kind of confined it to, initially, we confined it to those contractors who come to our premises. So not so much the records management or the archiving crew that work off site or the delivery drivers that deliver things to us. But we started with our cleaners, like most of you on the call, I'm guessing. And we run quite a lot of events on site as well. And so from time to time, we need extra bar staff or wait staff, that kind of thing. So we worked with temp agencies on that just to make sure that we were paying the living wage there. And like Justin, varied those contracts accordingly. And to be fair, we found that our suppliers have been incredibly engaged with us on this. And so I actually had a meeting with our cleaning company recently, and they're contemplating making it a standard for them as a business rather than on charging that client, rather than on charging that to particular clients, actually just employing all the cleaners at the living wage. And his view on that, which I think I personally agree with, is that if they lose clients because of that, then that's fine. That's clients that they don't necessarily want to be aligned with. And so the third piece of criteria, which we needed a little bit of guidance from Felicia on, only because it was particularly new for us, was just making employees aware that they have access to a union. Excuse me. And so the Aotearoa Legal Workers Union is relatively new in New Zealand, and they're doing some great work. But we just needed to be clear on and take some guidance around how we actually convey to staff that there is a union out there. So we provide all of that information in our weekly newsletters that go out to all partners and staff every week. And so we do that each year just as part of that recertification process. And the fourth, I guess, was just to make sure that our employees' terms and conditions of employment weren't reduced in any way in order to meet that living wage commitment, so that we weren't taking a week's leave off them in lieu of giving them annual leave or an increased rate or anything like that. And so that one was quite easy for us to work through as well. And so we became certified about 4 weeks later. So for us, it was relatively straightforward. I would say that the most complex part was probably just working with the suppliers to start with. But as I said, as soon as you started that conversation with them, they were incredibly easy to work with, and which we found to be quite sort of validating. And I guess the last thing that I was going to talk to, which I've touched a little bit on already, is just that benefits of being accredited, particularly for the legal service industry. And so, I've talked about our values and it just seemed to us to be the right thing to do. But our clients and employees are asking us quite a lot about what we're doing in this space. I sit in on quite a lot of job interviews, and if it's not flexibility, if it's not sustainability, it's workers' rights and what are you doing about things like overtime and living wage and that type of thing. So for us, it's clearly important to our people and our clients, and it's incredibly important to us. And so from a legal services perspective, I think it just demonstrates the care that legal firms ought to have for people in their communities, and by extension of their clients as well. So that's me, but very happy to take sort of any questions either now or after, much like Justin, very happy for Felicia to share my details if anyone wants anything else from me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jordan. We're going to move on to the practical side of the criteria and the process. But before I start sharing my screen, I just want to reiterate what both Jordan and Justin have said, that through this accreditation process, we may have you thinking about areas of your business that you hadn't before. For example, the offer of union access. And I want you to know that we will hold your hand right through the whole process. For some businesses, it takes 4 weeks, as Jordan said, but for other businesses, it's a journey. And I know of some where it's taken 3 years even. So bear that in mind, that you're not in this alone. And I'm going to try and figure out how to share my screen again. So you've got the criteria in front of you. Okay, it's the former Mayor of Wellington City Council, Justin Lester, holding up his accreditation certificate. They were the first City Council to become a living wage employer. Now, the first criterion for our accreditation criteria: all directly employed workers shall receive no less than the current living wage rate. The living wage rate applies to all workers aged 16 years and older. That is whether they are living at home, whether they're still at school, working part-time, fixed-term contract. If they are a casual worker, you'd be looking at paying at least the current living wage rate plus 8%. So a little bit of a no-brainer there, okay? Your living wage, the current living wage rate becomes your baseline. All indirectly employed workers delivering a service on a regular and ongoing basis shall receive at least the current living wage rate. So as Jordan mentioned, look at the regular and ongoing part of this criterion. Look at roles where, if not for contracting out, you would hire in-house. Typically the ones we see are cleaners and security guards, but also look at your catering staff or facilities maintenance. It's not going to be any ad hoc services such as your couriers or the people who come to change the toner on your photocopier. And the rule of thumb with this criterion is that if you have any questions or you are unsure, please contact. Now, when you apply for accreditation, we will ask to see supporting evidence that your indirectly employed workers are receiving the current living wage rate. What that looks like is a letter or an email from your contracting company confirming that criterion. If your cleaners are earning $35 an hour, we don't need to know the exact rate, just that it's at least the current living wage rate. Now, our third one, all employees shall be offered union access. This sometimes can be a little bit confronting for businesses who have not had an experience with a union or have had a past experience which hasn't been favourable. But this is very straightforward. If you don't have a collective agreement in place, we ask that you send an email out to all of your staff, including 2 website links. It's to the Find Your Own Union website and to the MB website. Now, I can even send you a draft email to make that easier. You don't need to know exactly which union to direct them to. They're able to go and research their own union through that Find Your Own website link. Now, there is also no obligation for them to join a union, okay? Going forward, we ask that those 2 website links be included in your offer of employment. That's going to cover you for any new employees coming on board. So when your license is renewed and Sammy, our admin support, asks if this criteria has been ticked, you can say yes, it's in our offer of employment. Okay. I think Jordan explained the 4th point quite well. No terms and conditions should be reduced to meet the cost of delivering the living wage. Another way to look at it is that if you currently offer your staff an insurance policy at no cost, but on becoming a living wage employee, you take away that insurance policy to meet the cost of delivering the living wage, that's not okay. Okay. I think that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to move on to our flow chart. So once you know that within your business you have fulfilled that criteria, you will complete an application form accompanied by supporting evidence that your indirectly employed workers are receiving at least the current living wage rate, and also supporting evidence that you have offered your employees union access. The application is presented to our Accreditation Advisory Committee, who really are the gurus of the accreditation program and have put together the guidelines for the program. They meet once a month, usually on the 4th Friday of the month. They review the application, assuming that they approve the application. You will then receive a license to sign and also an invoice for your annual accreditation fee. Now, the license will be signed by yourself and returned and countersigned by a member of our governance board. Once we receive that countersigned license and we can see that your accreditation fee has been paid, you'll receive a confirmation that the accreditation process is complete. You'll receive a copy of that countersigned license, also an accreditation certificate. Your accreditation is valid for 1 year. At the end of 1 year, or just before your accreditation anniversary, you'll be contacted with a license renewal form, and that's our audit process. It will be quite similar to the application process. We just want to make sure that nothing's changed within your business that will impact your accreditation. And I just have to draw attention to this incredible flowchart that's been put together by our living wage employer Ocular, who has also put together our Christmas catalogue. So a shout out for that Christmas catalogue. It's on our website. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, I am going to open the floor or screen for questions. We've got Matthew Clark, Administrative Organiser from Te Ohu Whakawhanonga, managing our chat. Te Ohu Whakawhanonga is a living wage employer and also a living wage member group. We ask that you just be respectful and sensitive in the chat. And I'm going to call on Jordan and Justin also to be available to answer questions. What have we got, team?
Kia ora, Felicia. Well, it's been pretty quiet. We just had a couple of questions about can people have the slides and the recording so to share it with colleagues. But no other questions. If anyone has one, you could possibly take yourself off mute and pose it to the team now.
We will be sharing a recording of this webinar. We post it up to social media, but if you don't have social media, if you just contact myself or Finn, we'll be happy to share it. Can we find a list of accredited employees? Yes, there's a list on the website. That list is connected to the employers that send us their logos. If you're looking to see if a specific employer is accredited, but you can't see their logo, please feel free to contact me. The current annual fee for accreditation, that is on the website also. It's based on whether you are a business, a charity, or a public sector organisation, and relates to the number of employees you have. And it's also in the back of the beautiful lookbook, Annie has said. Have there been any examples of indirect workers that are in scope that you might not expect or first think of? None that come to mind. None that come to mind. Typically cleaners and security guards.
With some caterers and
Yeah, with
yeah,
caterers sometimes facilities maintenance. But again, if there's a grey area, please contact me.
Yeah, and I kind of just echo that as well on the catering side of things. So I alluded to having, we were reviewing a whole lot of previously outsourced functions as part of this, the time that we were also looking at this, and so that's why that formed part of it. So we've got some catering staff on site as well that we used to outsource. Now they're all direct employees.
it's interesting also, Jordan, you mentioned the mail room, and I think that mail rooms have also been a feature from time to time.
That's right, yeah, but that, much like catering for us, that was a previously outsourced function that we then brought in as well. And there were several reasons why we did that, but one relevant for this discussion is that often we find, at least, that when you're sort of outsourcing quite a large function, it can be it can be sometimes, depending on the nature of it, it can be outsourced offshore. It can be outsourced in quite a specific area of New Zealand, quite often in sort of minimum wage realms, depending on the type of function that it serves as well. And so we just wanted much more control over that, and quite frankly more responsibility over it, so that we could be more accountable for that service delivery.
Yeah, it sounds, Jordan, like we have a lot in common in that regard. We've got a couple of cafes and a restaurant, and we actually brought catering in-house, and are seeing significant benefits as a result, actually. Not just living wage, but having a full-time contract with an employer rather than a temporary kind of set of contracts via an agency is the churn rate is significantly dropped.
Just to follow on from what Jordan said in terms of offshore workers, the living wage rate only applies to workers in New Zealand. If you have workers in the Philippines or outside of New Zealand, they're going to have a different living wage rate. Okay, so it doesn't apply. Can you please link on the website? There is information about accreditation fees and what this covers. I'll leave that to you, Matt. Your accreditation fee covers basically your membership as an accredited living wage employer for the year. Fees go into the general operation of the movement. We're a non-party political movement, and so we are very much based on receiving fees from grants and accreditation fees and membership fees. Okay, Matthew's popped that up there. Are there any more questions? Examples of how an employer with contractors receiving a daily rate that hours work.
That was actually something that I think Jordan referred to by taking what was being paid on, by checking it on a monthly basis. Was that something that you were saying, Jordan?
Yes, I think there's a distinction to be made between kind of the regular contractors that you would typically pay on an hourly basis, like a cleaner or security guard service, versus a contractor that you're contracting services to. So if I'm struggling to think of an example, but where there's a contractor that you've engaged with for a discrete piece of work or a project or something like that, we do have those from time to time, but we typically found that we were obviously paying them quite a bit more because they're self-employed and they've got their own sort of indirect costs to manage. So they kind of fell outside that scope for us, at least. But certainly for those suppliers that and most of our suppliers, even quite deep down the supply chain, we kind of influence, not for accreditation, but just because we check that off. If it's at a sort of per hourly basis that we pay the service, then we check that off every month when the bill comes in. Equally, for some of them, our cleaners in particular, and our external wait staff that we get in from time to time, we actually have a signed undertaking from them. Not only is it in the contract, but they've undertaken to make sure that they do that. With cleaning in particular, it's actually quite administratively heavy, is my understanding, having spoken to our cleaning company about it, which is part of the reason why they're contemplating just doing it, is because it's actually really unfair on the cleaners, because what I learned through going through this process is that the way cleaning businesses are structured generally is, if we have a cleaner, just take Rose as an example, if Rose worked for us part of the day and we were a living wage provider, she might work for another client part of the day who isn't, and so that person will get quite a mixed rate. I guess they will get paid the 6 hours they might work for us and 5 hours at the minimum wage somewhere else, but it actually creates quite an internal issue where even the cleaners themselves now have started to decline work for those organisations that aren't paying the living wage, who are by far in the minority from what I hear. So there is that sort of unfairness to it, and certainly from an employer, if I were to put myself in the shoes of the cleaning company, when they're doing rosters and things like that, I understand it to be largely kind of luck of the draw, how cleaners are assigned to clean particular organisations. So some may have more work that pays the living wage and some may have less, and so there's a real inequity there, I think, which kind of talks to how we've tried to work with all of our suppliers to have that kind of as a minimum benchmark for us to just engage their services.
I'm happy to answer the next question if you like, Felicia. Which is about the gap between the minimum wage and the living wage. One of the things that as a movement right from the beginning we've been really clear to distinguish is that there is a difference. One is a government set rate that is regulated. It's based on a minimum wage act. They make a decision every year whether or not they'll increase it. And that's in a sense a political decision. They'll have a bit of research or feedback consultation before they set that rate, but it's a highly politicised decision. It's not based on need. Whereas when we set out to create an independent living wage, we wanted to ensure that it was need that was addressed, what the costs were to somebody to live a basic yet decent life. And so we have maintained a very clear distinction between the living wage and the minimum wage. But that's not to say that the living wage hasn't influenced greatly the increase of the living wage of the minimum wage, because every time it comes out, now the media and others compare the two. And so I think that the impact of the conversation about the living wage has had a very positive roll-on effect for the minimum wage, but the two we keep also very separate. We're a civil society movement, not government.
Fantastic. Thanks, Annie. Annie, you might not like to answer the next question. Do you have any examples where this works while bargaining with unions is taking place, which goes past the 1st September date, but the agreement has not been ratified? In that case, does backdating once agreement is ratified work, or must it be paid from 1st of September regardless?
You can, some of the negotiations will include a provision that says at the point at which the living wage goes up, the rates in the document will go up. So some of it refer directly to that September deadline. So it really depends on the wording in the agreement. You can't retain your accreditation if you don't increase the rates, but almost all collective agreements are minimum rate documents and not paid rate documents. But what you probably find is that if you're negotiating that as part of your collective agreement, then that will influence the way you construct a clause in your agreement. I think that it has influenced a lot of collective bargaining, and quite often collective agreements are stepping their way towards a living wage rate and estimating what it might be. In some instances, even overshooting the mark by quite a bit in order to ensure that they don't fall under the living wage when the expiry comes around or when the next step in the increase comes around.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions? No? If you have 1 more minute to post or speak. No? By all means,
hang on
if
a
you
second.
think,
Yes, there is. Sorry.
Oh,
there is another question. Can I be more specific? Well, what we don't want to end up is having increases to rates multiple times. Oh, I only refer to that because often that's negotiated. So the increases to the rates are negotiated maybe each year for a 3-year period before a particular collective agreement expires. Otherwise, you can put into a collective agreement that the rate of pay will increase to the level of the living wage as of September 1, even if your collective agreement doesn't expire for some time after that. But just to sort of assist, there are so many variations to collective agreements because they're negotiated between parties. If you would like any support in terms of the way you might construct clauses, just contact Felicia, because there are various people that she can reach out to, and we can supply different types of clauses that might work for you.
Great. Any other questions? If you think of questions after this webinar, by all means, reach out to me or Finn. My email address is accreditation@livingwage.org.nz. I'm more than happy to answer any questions following this call. Okay, I'd just like to thank our speakers, Jordan Cole and Justin Brochocki, for your sharing and your experience with the accreditation process, and also to Annie for answering questions. And again, please be in touch. We will be posting this webinar on social media. Please go onto our website and shop from our Christmas catalogue and support those accredited living wage employers out there. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing you and receiving your applications. Have a lovely afternoon. Ka kite.